Hi, it's Dad. You need to call your mom more often. And I'm going to paint up this Ionus Cryptborn box set for my brother-in-law, who needs them in a hurry for a tournament. He's doing the bases and the 2 riders for the small dragons to help me out, but I'm taking on the rest. I do regular miniature zenithal priming with a little tweak. Before I do the final ivory dry brushing, I hit the darker dragon with some Nuln Oil and the little dragons with some blue wash. Hopefully this helps with creating contrast down the road. Oh, and Kale, thanks for assembling all the dragons. I pick a random assortment of green inks and begin with a blue-leaning forest green from scale 75 for most of the leathery skin, and some other select elements to hopefully tie everything together down the road. I add highlights that are away from bones and recesses by adding in a mossier green, then switch to navy blue tinted with black for the armor and center scales. I do some initial small highlighting on the scales by just throwing some Baroth blue into the mix, but first I need to clean up the wings because my brother-in-law didn't clean up the leftover sprue nubs. I didn't realize till now, but that's fine. Tiny mistake, it happens. I literally can no longer paint wings without using orange bags. I just add some yellow to my previous mossy color and aim for mostly sorta between the fingets of the wings. It doesn't have to be perfect though. It's alright to get a bit of overspray. It'll probably look a little more natural. The wings are looking a little bit blown out, so I add some dilute brown ink to give some depth. I want the plate armor to be distinct from the scale armor, so I mix the physically closest gray and blue contrast paints, and I smush it into all of the armor's nooks and crannies. Probably not actually going to see a lot of this at the end, but it's going to be a really good starting place. It's tempting to use yet another color for the fabric, but I don't want this looking like a clown parade, so I just mix some lime green ink into my original forest green dragon color. We'll come back to the fabric, but I get distracted and I mix the forest and moss green together for some quick dry brushing. I decide on a blue mid-tone for the armor and begin glazing up to a highlight. Then I remember I don't have forever to paint this, so I go right to the oh wait, no, never mind, there's more sprue nubs I have to clean up. Not a big deal. It happens. Anyway, I go right to the highest highlight, which is Baroth blue. From here, I can just worry about blending it into the lowlights, eventually with one unifying glaze color. It's less control, but it's way faster. There we go. Now I can just take that mid-tone and I can dilute it, and I can take about 3 passes across this thing, kind of just glazing those highlights into the lowlights. When I say I lose control, I mean it. This all actually ends up being not quite exactly how I want it to turn out, but it's not, it's not that bad. It's pretty close to what I was going for, and it's a lot quicker this way. Almost forgot about Mr. Grumpy over here, so pick him up while we're at it. He's basically a space marine, right? Like, they're space marines. Shoot, I don't really like space marines. I like this guy, though. He's got character. I like all the skulls. Very skull punk. I feel like the skulls should be kind of coppery, so I start them off with Balthazar Gold, and I do the metal on the base while I'm at it. So this is the dragon we're going to have to be reproducing. I'm not a huge fan of the paint scheme, but thankfully I do know the artist.
It's me.
The idea is just to use Warlord Purple and Kirkland brand Genestealer Purple. Base coat everything. Find more sprue dubs that you left. Kale. God! Fix up the wingdings on the old model while we're at it. Then finally, we can go with a nearly pure Warlord Purple to highlight everything a bit, especially on the wings where it's going to be a little bit thinner. I'm at it again with the orange bags, but this time I'm building up with a Sunset Ochre. Finally, I blend the ochre into the purple with a fluorescent pink. I can't find the masking tape anywhere, so I de-stickify some Scotch tape using the fuzzy sweater trick, and I mask off the wings so I can paint the tougher scales. I could have done this with a brush, but I'm on a deadline. I stick to the same dark blue as the other dragon, but I use a scale 75 Baroth blue equivalent for the highlighting, even though I have Baroth blue nearby, because I have all these paints, and what's the point of having them if you're not going to use them? After spending like months painting non-metallic metal gold, it's actually kind of the most relaxing thing in the world to just use Retributor armor right out of the pot. I also don't really want to fuss around with the leather too much, so I just paint everything an off-white and then hit it with snakebite leather, which doesn't actually turn out that great and I have to fix it up a little bit later. But we'll get to that when we get to that. I don't know why I focused on this pot of paint for so long. I guess I thought people really would want to take a close look at it. But anyway, if you drench Retributor armor in Gilman's Flesh contrast paint, it creates super warm gold really easy, and then you just have to touch up the gold a little bit. Time to do the basing. I bought this texture paint ages ago, but then I was running low, so I started pouring Mod Podge and paint and other random things into it just because I didn't want to buy a new one. And it's like a perpetual stew at this point. It probably contains none of the original gunk, and it just kind of is what it is now. I pull out absolutely everything I have for vegetation and foliage. I got basically like string that's fake moss. I have little fake flowers. I sprinkle flocking of 2 different kinds all over everything, just kind of smush stuff around. I got the great idea to use Pigment Fixer to hold everything in place, and it kind of seems to work, but the only problem is it's not quite strong enough. I probably wouldn't do it again. And finally, I just primed the thing by taking some gray primer and mixing in a bunch of Flow Aid. I would just airbrush this in place, but the airbrush would only hit the high points, and the primer wouldn't really get into the cracks and crevices. When I'm done with that, I just switch over to a white primer and I hit the high points. Contrast paints are great for basing, and I picked 2 greens that match my palette. One small mistake is I decide there needs to be a bit more brown in worn, dirty spots, and I very slightly overdo it. But maybe you disagree. Sometimes these things get in my head as failures, and I show someone and they're like, hey, what are you talking about? That looks good. So who knows? I also take a little bit of green ink to hit the moss just to make it a little bit different. I grab some Athonian Camo Shade and I smush that into some of the low points that look a little washed out. I just kind of fuss around with it. To highlight the gold, I just add an aluminum. It's a lot easier than just having a secondary color just for highlighting gold. Alright, time to fix the nasty leather. I add more and more off-white yellow tinted paint to the contrast and just build up the highlights in the flat sections, adding more and more of the white as I go. This is usually how I fix pooling issues with contrast paint. And when I'm done, I'm already done highlighting. Truth be told, this was me just trying something out. I had no idea if this would work. I just painted some areas of the stone orange, some of them blue, and then I just kind of smooshed everything together with a wet brush. Feels like a good time to finish up the fabric that I started before. So I take the same paints as before, but I add some more lime ink for the highlights, and then eventually I just use the pure forest green as a glaze to paint in the shadows. At the end of the process, I add in a little bit of that off-white yellow that I used before to the lime green, and use that as kind of a finishing glaze and edge highlight. The base needs some more detail, so I dry brush with a gray for some quick results, and then I slap some dirty down verdigris onto all of the copper on the model. It came out so nice last time, I decide that, how could it go wrong to just thickly slap it onto everything and not worry about thinning it down. Turns out if you do that, the chemical reaction doesn't really bring out the color of the formula, and it just looks like black sludge. So lesson learned, we'll fix that later. But for now, I also take the dirty down moss effect and try that out. And holy cow, it's so good. Look at that. It's just like one coat and it looks like moss. For the teeth and the claws, once it's based in a bone white, I mix up 50-50 Seraphim Sepia and 2 thin coats Antique Sepia, which is kind of my new favorite way to do bone as it requires minimum touch-ups. The wings are also looking kind of washed out, so I pick out the finger ribs of the wings with that mossy green from earlier, adding in a bit of white for the edges and ridges. I use the same mossy green on the scruffs throughout his body and highlight that up to a yellow. Going back to the copper metal, I touched up again with Balthazar Gold to clean up some of the dirty down gunk that got everywhere, and then highlight it with True Copper. The various flags I paint with a light green up to an off-white, leaving the recesses darker. Notice how bad it looks on the first pass? I think sometimes people just really don't trust the process of painting, and they immediately panic when things start to look a little bit streaky. But good painting takes multiple passes, it takes multiple layers, and you do have to trust that process. I think the scales were the most fun part of this model. I do a rough, sketchy glaze along the scales with forest green, not really looking for really crisp lines, but setting the stage for the final lines we're going to be painting in. I take that forest green, I add in a little bit of yellow, a little bit of flow improver if it needs it, and then I draw very light, sketchy lines. And the nice thing about this approach is if you have a shaky hand or you kind of mess up your lines, that's so fine, because it's like animal scales. They're not going to look perfect and uniform anyway. A glaze of purple on the closest interior of the scales blends everything together. I come running back to Baroth Blue, even though I cheated on him. I don't deserve him, really. Unfortunately, the blue ended up being a little too muted, so I have to go back and reinforce some of those highlights, and also pick out all of the edge highlighting on the armor. And this is how I fix the copper I messed up before. I take this Twinkling Lights green, I take some thinner, in this case I'm using Mona Lisa thinner. I squish the paint, the oil paint, all over the place. I let it set for about 20 minutes, and then I come back with a sponge and a Q-tip, and I clean up most of the excess without using any thinner. Then I take the sponge, add a little bit of thinner to it, and I use that on the highest high points of the copper. That way we get a gradient from the highest worn parts of the copper without any verdigris, all the way down to the recesses where the verdigris is most represented. At this point I'm starting to panic because I don't have much time to finish this and the little dragons aren't done. So I paint some white onto the tips of its dragon scruff. Then I airbrush those painted sections where the scruff meets the limb to create a quick fluorescent gradient with a white highlight on top. After that I do the bones, same as I did the big dragon. I also do its scale, using the scale base blue color that I used before and highlighting up to yellow. And at this point we're done. And now I need to figure out how to do glamour shots of these because they don't actually have the base on them, so I don't really know how to set them up. Oh yeah, the tournament that these were for, it got canceled. Of course it got canceled.